Horizon TV, the beacon for the nation.
Assalamu alaikum and thank you for tuning in. You're watching Live Real Talk. My name is Sumaya Hussein. I'll be sitting in for Faisal Qasim. Today we're going to be discussing the state of the economy in Kenya, and just to give you an overview of where we're at, we're looking at heavy debt burden, we're looking at inflation, we're looking at high cost of living, we're looking at loss of jobs, we're also looking at depreciation of the Kenyan shillings, or rather fluctuating here and there. And remember, all this is against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, which worsened the already existing economic crisis in the country. So today we're going to talk about how exactly we got into this crisis and how we're going to get out of it. And joining me in studio today is former Mandera Senator Hon Billow Kerrow, an economist and also the former chair of the Senate Finance Committee. Assalamu alaikum, Heshman. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you.
All right, we're just going to jump straight into the interview, and I'll start by asking, Heshmia, what do you think caused the economic crisis that we're looking at right now?
Bismillah. I think generally the responsibility of managing the economy in general is the responsibility of the governments. So if the economy is in bad shape, then it means the government stewardship of the economy is bad. I think in our case, from 2017, after the elections, the management of the economy has been pretty bad. And even before that, I think we were on a wrong trajectory that was responsible for the poor state of the economy. And of course, pandemic that started around this time last year made the matters worse. So I think that, in my view, really, it's more of the government's handling of the economy. I think that's where the issue is, because even before the pandemic, that problem, Kenyans have been complaining about the poor state of the economy. There's no money, no jobs. Earnings are down, everyone is complaining. So the situation has not been better even before the start of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Very true. And speaking of government management, recently we've been seeing the government taking very many loans and causing us to get into a heavy debt burden. We're looking at maybe over 7 trillion. So do you mind explaining or mentioning some of the negative effects this heavy debt burden is going to have, both long-term and short-term, on the economy?
Mm-hmm. The debt comes as a result of the government's attempt or failure to balance its expenditures with its revenue. Because that's basically what the government is supposed to do. It's supposed to spend the taxpayers' money. So taxpayers, who are the citizens of the country, in this case Kenyans, would pay taxes to the government, and the government should use that tax to run its programs. But where the government then ends up spending more than it can collect, then it ends up borrowing to cover the deficit, because then they will end up in a deficit. And so for a very long time now, the government of Kenya has been running on a deficit, what we call budget deficit or fiscal deficit. That runs almost between 8 to 10%. So it's a huge amount. And just to give you an idea, for example, currently, the government's budgeted expenditure is about shillings 3.3 trillion. And what the government is able to collect in terms of revenue is about shillings 1.8 maximum, 1.6 to 1.8 trillion. You can see that it's just slightly over half. And so the balance of the money, the government can only raise it through borrowing. And so this practice or culture of borrowing has been there for a while, but in the last 7 years or so of this particular administration, Jubilee administration, the situation has become pretty bad. They have borrowed much more, in fact, more than all the other previous administrations combined, and so the level of debt has really gone high, very high, to the point where anyone really who is not in Treasury will be concerned. Of course, those in Treasury or the government are not concerned, because it's the taxpayers who will pay the money. If there's any default, if there's any problem with the debt, they know it's you who's going to pay the money. So basically, I think the most important thing to note is that governments are supposed to spend taxpayers' money. There is no other source of money they can spend. And we, as government, they should not, unless it's absolutely necessary, really live beyond its means. It's just like an individual. You spend, if you start living beyond your means, sooner or later you will get into a situation where you become, bankrupt, and your properties or assets get, mortgaged, sold or whatever to recover the money that you have borrowed. And so governments also get into the same situation. They borrow to the point where the debt becomes unsustainable. They cannot service it. The level of revenue that you have is not enough to pay the debt and to also provide for your operations. And this is the situation we are in today. I've just mentioned that in a situation where our revenues are about 1.8, maximum 1.6, 1.8 trillion, and we have an expenditure target of 3.3 trillion, clearly we are going to spend well over a trillion. This year, in fact, for the first time in the history of this country, this year, 2021, this administration has to pay 1 trillion shillings to service debt. It's the highest that has ever been paid by our government. So if we collect 1.8 trillion shillings this year, 1 trillion will be spent to service debt straight away. Now, the amount of money that remains is not going to be enough to cover even the operations of the government. It will be barely enough to cover even just the salaries or the wage bill of the government. So that means then, other operations of the government may not get financed. Development projects will not get financed. Remittances they send to the counties will not get financed. And so what will the government do? What the government will do is what they're already doing. They are taking more loans to pay the maturing loans. So it is a situation which we say in economics, we are in a debt trap. In other words, you have to borrow to pay a debt which is maturing. Unachukua loan kulipa loan ingine. This is the situation that we find ourselves in. So was it necessary for the government to borrow all this? This is something that Kenyans really should ask themselves. The law is very clear, the Constitution. The government can only borrow amounts or to the extent that is approved by Parliament, in this case the National Assembly, according to the Constitution. And so Parliament sets a limit, that the government can borrow, and individual, loans, whatever, must be approved or ratified or, by Parliament. So the way things work is that in a situation where Parliament becomes largely subservient to the executive, then the executive does what it wants. So the government has been borrowing money, and Parliament has, given them a blank check to do as they want over the last, 7 years or so, and particularly the National Assembly over the last 7 years or so. So the government has been borrowing, as it is doing now. In fact, now, only last year they increased the debt limit to a maximum of 9 trillion. Today they are going to submit again another application to raise it maybe to as much as even 12 trillion. And Parliament, if I heard the majority leader speaking early this week or last week, says we have no problem even raising it to 20 trillion. And so this is the thing. This, unfortunately, some of the people in government do not appreciate the risks attached to the high borrowing, because what happens is that you will not be able to service this debt, and other expenditures of the government will suffer as a result. And so soon the country may default. We have seen other countries in Africa that have defaulted. In other words, they have failed to meet their obligations. When the loan is due and you have not paid, then you default. And if you default, the consequences are very, very high. You know, that you will not borrow again from most of the international institutions. Investments will not be coming in. If at all you are going to borrow from banks or whatever, it's going to be at a very high premium, and so forth. There are a lot of risks attached to this. So yes, we are in a serious situation where the you know, the economy is in Kenya has been reduced to just borrow and spend on projects which cannot be explained. If you look at the amount of money borrowed by this government in the last 7 years, it's about 7 trillion. But when you look at where that money has been spent, you cannot, if you are told to itemize development projects, because they always argue that the money has been borrowed for development. And if we were to challenge the government to provide a list of development projects that add up to the 7 trillion shillings, they would not be able to prove that. So the money is being used for consumption. It's being used to pay salaries. It's being used to run governments. But when it's being borrowed, it's borrowed to finance development. And unfortunately, this is you know, this is the situation in which we find ourselves in this country. We are heavily indebted, and our situation is not pretty good.
Mheshimiwa, I like that you mentioned we take more loans to repay already existing debts. So I'd like to ask, would it have made a difference if the government decided to take loans from domestic markets instead of foreign markets?
Well, debt is a debt. It doesn't make an awful lot of difference where you borrow from. But of course, the foreign debts are denominated in foreign currency, in dollars or pounds or whatever, you know, in euros. And so the risk when the shilling depreciates is that you're going to add much more. For example, even now, 50% of our debt is foreign and 50% is domestic. So every time the shilling goes down by 1, you know, is devalued by 1 shilling to the dollar, you know, it adds an extra 20-30 billion shillings to the loan. So it's quite significant impact in terms of the, particularly when our currency, like for example, January last year, Kenya shilling was trading at 100, 101. January this year, it is at 109, 110. You know, 10% depreciation. That's a huge amount of money that we lose in terms of the additional obligations that we have to pay because of the currency. Now, the borrowing domestically also has its own risks because you are going to crowd out the private sector. If every time the government is out there in the banks collecting loans through treasury bills or treasury bonds or whatever instruments they use to borrow from banks, then banks would find it easier to lend to government because loans given to government are risk-free. You know, and banks treat it as a premium because what happens is these are sovereign loans and it's guaranteed. The governments cannot default on their loans. If you lend to somebody, an SME, a Jokali, or to my business, I might fail or default in the loan. But so the banks would always give a priority to a government loan. So what happens is that when the government borrows heavily in the domestic market, then the credit to the private sector is reduced proportionately. And this has happened quite often, where when you look at it in the last, I think 3 years, the credit to the private sector has reduced significantly from about 25% to, I'm being told, is about 8% now. It's going down significantly because banks are finding it easier to lend to government than to lend to businesses. And that is, you know, in economics, that's very bad because then the productive, you know, sectors of the economy are the ones that require money. Businesses, farmers, you know, manufacturers. This is where the money needs to go to. These are the people who need to be given money so that they can invest and generate incomes, generate revenues. Lending to government doesn't. The government doesn't get revenue from itself. It gets revenue largely from the businesses. So borrowing domestically has its own challenges, but this government has taken 50-50. So as we speak now, the debts are 50-50, foreign and 50. Yeah.
Well, it seems like we're not quite heading to the right direction, because the government is planning to borrow over 700 million just from domestic markets in this financial year alone. You're watching Live Real Talk. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to discuss some of the strategies the government is putting in place but is simply not working. Stay tuned for that.
Horizon TV, the beacon for the nation. Pearls of Wisdom.
Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, may Allah be pleased with him, narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "O Allah, I take refuge in you from anxiety and sorrow, weakness and laziness, miserliness and cowardice, the burden of debts, and from being overpowered by men."
بسم الله الحمد لله والثناء لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. حديث yetu wiki hii ni hadithi ya Abi Hurairah radhiyallahu anhu iliyopokewa katika Sahih Muslim. Asema Abi Hurairah radhiyallahu anhu anna Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam qala: "La taj'alu buyutakum maqabir. Inna ash-shaytana yanfiru min al-bayt alladhi tuqra'u fihi suratul Baqarah." Rawahu Muslim. Asema Bwana Mtume sallallahu alaihi wasallam, musijalie au musifanye majumba zenu kuwa kama makaburi. Bimaana makaburini watu huwa hawafanyi ibada pale, hawaswali wala hawafanyi mengine, ni kwenda kuzika na kustiri. Basi Bwana Mtume sallallahu alaihi wasallam akatupa mfano ya ibada ambayo tutakayofanya katika majumba zetu ili isiwe kama makaburi. Na unapofanya ibada hiyo, faida ni kwamba sheitani hakaribii nyumba hiyo. Akamalizia kusema, inna shaitana yanfiru min albayti, kwa hakika sheitani huikimbia nyumba, alladhi ambayo tuqra'u fihi suratul Baqara, ndani ya hiyo nyumba husoma suratul Baqara. Maashara almuslimin, tunaposema uisome suratul Baqara, alqiraa la yakunu illa bitalaffuz. Qiraa haiwezi kuitwa qiraa mpaka mtu kutamka kwa ulimi, wa tahriki shafataini, kadhalika awe ni mwenye kuisoma kwa midomo yake. Kwa hivyo unapotaka shetani asiwe katika nyumba yako, basi isome suratul Baqara kwa ulimi wako, kadhalika kwa mdomo wako. Kwa nini? Kwa sababu hivyo ndivyo shetani atakavyokimbia. Waweza kuwasha kaseti, kuwasha TV, ukaweka YouTube, ukaweka suratul Baqara, lakini athari hupatikana kubwa zaidi pindi unapoisoma Qur'an hiyo na unapoisoma suratul Baqara. Na unaposoma suratul Baqara, ujue ya kwamba patapatikana amani katika hiyo nyumba. Na usipoisoma suratul Baqara, basi shetani atakuja kupiga kambi ndani ya hiyo nyumba. Tumomba Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala atuwafikie na anijalie mimi na wewe tuweze kuisoma suratul Baqara. Ahsantum wa jazakumullahu khaira.
Uislamu ambao ni maarufu kwetu sisi ni Uislamu ambao ulioletwa na Bwana Mtume sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Ni risala alotuachia mtume wetu mtukufu, yenye kutuongoza kwenye njia ya kumridhisha Muumba na kujenga imani zetu.
Na risala hii haikuletwa ila kwa mtume wa mwisho vile vile, ambaye ni Mtume Muhammadin sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Ni mirathi ya mitume inayotupa mwelekeo kwenye dini ya Kiislamu, ungana na Sheikh Saad Ahmed upate kufahamu ujumbe alotuachia mtume wetu sallallahu alayhi wasallam kila siku ya Alhamisi kwenye Horizon TV.
Horizon TV, the beacon for the nation.
Welcome back to Live Real Talk. My name is Sumaya Hussein. We're discussing the state of the economy with Honorable Billow Kerrow here in studio with us. He's the former Mandera senator. Before we took a break, we looked at some of the causes of the economic crisis in the country, and now we're scrutinizing the strategies that the government is putting in place, but simply not working out. So, Mheshimiwa, do you mind pointing out what you feel is being done to stimulate the economy, but is just not providing results or working out?
Okay, let me first point out what the government is doing to make the situation worse, or rather to mess up the economy. One, I think I've mentioned at length, was the issue of debt, the huge public debt. There's no elephant in the room today in this country regarding our economy is the huge public debt, which is being taken by government ostensibly to finance, these infrastructure projects. And the government's argument has been that the more we invest in infrastructure, the SDRs, and the ports, the Lamu, and all these things, the energy projects in Olkarias and so forth, the government's argument is that the returns will be so high that there will be more revenue, there will be more jobs, there will be more incomes. But that has not happened. 7 years after we had the SGR started, and I think it started in 2013 or so, and with hundreds of billions, spent today, the SGR cannot even repay its operations. It's been making losses, just simple operations. And the objective was really in some of these investments, for example, to enhance our competitiveness in the region. For example, the cost of freight is one of the major costs in our production, in our businesses, in our manufacturing and so forth. So that if the cost of freight went down, then you would say the cost of our products would go down, and they would be competitive in the region. Similarly, if the cost of energy went down, then the cost of manufacturing, the cost of our businesses or our products would be lower, and so we'll be competitive in the region. But nothing has happened. Despite all the billions that have been spent on energy, we still have one of the most expensive energy in the region. If you look at freight, SGR has not helped. In fact, it's more expensive to use the SGR than to use the trucks. It defeats that. So the point is that we are borrowing for purposes that have not really benefited this country. That's one. And we must reduce the borrowing. We must really stop the borrowing. That is the reason why, another reason why I think that is very important is that in order to finance these loans, the government has to raise more taxes. We have seen last year when the government introduced taxes, on everything, literally. There's tax on fuel. There's tax on some of the basic commodities that Kenyans use. There's so much tax being charged that today the government has started taxing businesses on their capital through what they call the minimum tax. And so the level of taxation is so high that it is making, it's making it counterproductive, really, for businesses. The government has eliminated what we call capital allowances, the incentives that are normally given to businesses to invest so that they create more jobs. All this is being done because the government has to raise money in order to service these loans. So I think they must stop these loans, and this is not the time to tax people. This is the time when the government needs to really create tax incentives. Last year, because of the COVID, they reduced some of the taxes. But COVID is worse today than it was last year. And so thousands of people, Kenyans, are still without jobs. Many businesses have been closed and are not able to generate incomes to help Kenyans. So it's the time to try and incentivize businesses. This is not the time to punish, to raise more taxes. And this is what the government, all over the world, governments are reducing taxes so that they can bring back the economy, because most economies have been flattened by by COVID. Last year our economy contracted by 1%, when the government was hoping that it will grow by 6%. It didn't. It went to nearly zero. But the only way you can really get things going is to eliminate some of the taxes or reduce. But in the opposite is what's happening. This government is reducing taxes on all manner of taxes. This again is something that, in my view, is going to make the matters worse, and the government needs to relook at. It is not necessary for the government to tax Kenyans and spend on their behalf. No. Governments all over the world have an obligation to allow people to have money in their pockets and spend at their own discretion. And this is done through Parliament. I think the challenge we have today is that Parliament is not holding the government to account on taxes, because people must not be taxed to the point where it's no longer necessary. No country has ever developed because of huge amount of taxes, or taxing people today. It doesn't help, because people must invest in their money. People must spend on other things. You cannot just collect every penny that people have so that you can do some of the projects that you think are right. There are times when you can shelve. For example, in this crisis today, it's not right for government ministries, including county governments, spending money on some lavish office blocks, on some projects that are not a necessity today, when doctors don't have PPEs, we don't have medicines in some of our hospitals. We have many challenges. Our children do not have appropriate facilities in schools and so forth. So there are priorities, and one of the challenges we have had really in this economy is lack of prioritization. That is the single biggest challenge we have had. So you find governments spending on misplaced priorities and leaving very essential priorities, and this is some of the things which contribute to the challenges that we have. So in essence, then, what the government really needs to do is to create more opportunities for Kenyans. How do you do that? Because when you talk of opportunities, you're talking of employment, you're talking of more incomes. How do you give that? The government cannot employ everybody in this country, but the government can give incentives that will encourage people to be self-employed, or encourage businesses to employ people. And this is done by creating incentives for the businesses. For example, this is ours is largely a subsistence economy. 80% of our people survive on what we call subsistence economy. They are farmers. They survive on informal sectors, jokali, and so forth. So these people require support of the government. This is where the government needs to put money. But unfortunately, the government is putting money on the other 20%, what they call the modern sector. This is the areas that the government, you see, when the government is doing an SGR, the target is that it's going to help those guys who are in those big businesses, so that they can transport their goods or things like that. But I think what the government needs to do is to put money into the hands of the people who are running the economy of this country, the subsistence economy, the informal sector, what we call the SMEs. We have heard the government say that we are going to start a credit scheme. One of the challenges in the SMEs, for example, is access to credit. If you are running your own small business, you have started your small business, you need money to buy your stocks, to buy your equipment, or to expand your businesses. There are no banks who are going to give you money. Banks will require collateral that you don't have. What happens in many countries is that the government would guarantee those SMEs loans, so that then if you fail to service your loan, then the government will pay the bank. They have started something in Kenya, this financial year, to guarantee loans to the small and medium enterprises, but very small amount, to the tune of maximum of 10 billion. This is really nothing to take home. It is not. So my take is that they did start some stimulus sometime last year, some 57 billion that was to try and create some activity across the country. so that people can get earn some money here and there and try and boost the economy. But I think that is nothing in a population of 50 million, where only 2 million people are in formal jobs, and the rest of the people are depending on the informal sector. This is nothing, and I think the government deliberately needs to reduce the taxes and create more incentives. And when you look at the budget policy statement for this financial year, there isn't much really in terms of the way the policy intervention that the government is planning. It's still the same. There are no, this is an extraordinary time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not the normal times. You cannot just go by the normal way of doing things. We'll do this and the government will do this, and the same stuff that when you read what you read today in the budget policy statement this year would be probably, if you read it 4 or 5 years ago, it will be the same thing. Mm-hmm. I think we need a complete paradigm shift. This is when the government needs to sit back and say, wait a minute, man, we have lost a lot of jobs, we have lost a lot of businesses, our people are in crisis, there is a pandemic, our shilling has lost value significantly, but there are a lot of problems. So they need to look back. Our exporters are suffering. Some of the exports industries have been affected because of the lockdowns in many parts of the world. Mm-hmm. Businesses like tourism, which are related to tourism, the entire entertainment sector, hotels, hospitality sector has collapsed because of, you've seen, if you go around Nairobi, you'll see how many hotels are shut down. If you go to the coast, is worse. So millions of people in those industries have really suffered for more than a year now, for nearly a year now. So I think it would have been better for the government to sit back and say, no, let us help our people. Mm-hmm. Let us put money into those businesses. Let us put money into those sectors. Let us try and revive education. Universities, colleges, schools have been shut down. Many of those private ones have collapsed. And these are businesses that were employing people, that were generating income, that were providing taxes. Uh-huh. So I think we need to relook at our priorities, and unfortunately that does not seem to have been done if you look at the budget for this financial year coming. Mm-hmm.
Mheshimiwa, you talked about opportunities and creating employments and giving out incentives. So I'd like your thoughts on what you feel the BBI bill the effect will have on the economy of the country, considering it has been touted as a bill that will help revive the economy.
If anybody tells you that BBI is going to help the economy, I think obviously he's lying. As we say, he's lying through his teeth. It's a big lie. The BBI has nothing on the economy. Absolutely. I mean, if you go through that bill to amend the constitution, it doesn't. It's being billed as as a panacea to all our problems: the political, economic, social, every problem that we have in this country would be addressed by BBI. That's absolute nonsense. It doesn't. The economy, in fact, it will make the situation worse in terms of the economy, because it's created a very large executive, creating offices of the prime ministers, office of deputy prime ministers, and expanded the executive significantly. At a time when you are burdened already by huge debt, and falling revenues, and you can't even finance, the current government, and then you're expanding your executive, and then number two, you're expanding legislature significantly by nearly a third. Parliament itself will also be expanded, and so all these things will go with other institutions, that work with this executive and legislature. Then I think clearly some of the other measures again that have been included in the bill, including, for example, that more money, the money that goes to counties will not be less than 35%. That again would be another huge burden on them. So they've created so much burden that unfortunately it will make it worse for the economy, because people have to pay taxes. We don't get money from oil wells. We don't have any oil we're selling. We don't have gold. I mean, it's taxpayers. It's from our pocket. So you can imagine then if today we are spending 3.3 trillion, if everything in this bill is going to be implemented, our expenditure will go up to 4 trillion or more. And the government will still try to squeeze money from the same few taxpayers in this country that we have. And so the situation is going to be pretty, life is going to be much more difficult. I can imagine that the taxes will probably be raised again, more loans will be borrowed, if anybody is going to implement this. Unless, of course, this bill is not going to be implemented. But I can assure you the situation is going to get worse for the economy. So it's not going to help the economy. There's nothing in this bill. If the government wants to do something in this economy, nobody stops them to do what they want to do. It doesn't require a bill. It doesn't require a constitution. It doesn't require any of those stories. If the government has the mandate to run the economy of this country, and so they can do, if there's anything good that they want today, they can do it. There's nothing that stops them. Everything is already in the current 2010 constitution.
Thank you for that, Mheshimiwa. We are due for our second break, but I'll encourage you to send in your questions, comments, and feedbacks and chip into the discussion on our social media handles. You can use @HorizonTV Kenya, @Sumaya Hussein, use the hashtag #LiveRealTalk, ask us questions on the state of the economy, also send in your opinions. We're going for a break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about what we should be doing instead to help revive the economy. Stay tuned.
Horizon TV, the beacon for the nation.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
Pearls of Wisdom.
Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, may Allah be pleased with him, narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, O Allah, I take refuge in you from anxiety and sorrow, weakness and laziness, miserliness and cowardice, the burden of debts, and from being overpowered by men.
Horizon TV, the beacon for the nation.
بسم الله الحمد لله والثناء لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Hadithi yetu ya wiki hii ni hadithi ya Abi Hurairah radhiyallahu anhu iliyopokewa katika Sahih Muslim. Asema Abi Hurairah radhiyallahu anhu anna Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam qala la taj'alu buyutakum maqabir inna ash-shaytana yanfiru min al-bayt alladhi tuqra'u fihi suratul Baqarah. Rawahu Muslim. Asema Bwana Mtume sallallahu alayhi wasallam, musijalie au musifanye majumba zenu kuwa kama makaburi. Bimaana makaburini watu huwa hawafanyi ibada pale, hawaswali wala hawafanyi mengine, ni kwenda kuzika na kustiri. Basi Bwana Mtume sallallahu alaihi wasallam akatupa mfano ya ibada ambayo tutakayofanya katika majumba zetu ili isiwe kama makaburi. Na unapofanya ibada hiyo, faida ni kwamba sheitani hakaribii nyumba hiyo. Akamalizia kusema inna ash-shaytana yanfiru min al-bayt, kwa hakika sheitani huikimbia nyumba alladhi ambayo tuqra'u fihi suratul Baqarah, ndani ya hiyo nyumba husoma suratul Baqarah. Maashara almuslimin, tunaposema uisome suratul Baqarah, alqiraa la yakunu illa bitalaffuz. Qiraa haiwezi kuitwa qiraa mpaka mtu kutamka kwa ulimi wa tahriki shafataini, kadhalika awe ni mwenye kuisoma kwa midomo yake. Kwa hivyo unapotaka shetani asiwe katika nyumba yako, basi isome suratul Baqarah kwa ulimi wako, kadhalika kwa mdomo wako. Kwa nini? Kwa sababu hivyo ndivyo shetani atakavyokimbia. Waweza kuwasha kaseti, kuwasha TV, ukaweka YouTube, ukaweka suratul Baqarah, lakini athari hupatikana kubwa zaidi pindi unapoisoma Qur'an hiyo na unapoisoma suratul Baqarah. Na unaposoma suratul Baqarah, ujue ya kwamba patapatikana amani katika hiyo nyumba. Na usipoisoma suratul Baqarah, basi shetani atakuja kupiga kambi ndani ya hiyo nyumba. Tuombe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala atuwafikie na anijalie mimi na wewe tuweze kuisoma suratul Baqarah. Ahsantum wa jazakumullahu khairan.
Horizon TV, the beacon for the nation.
Welcome back to the program. Thank you for staying with us. We're talking about the state of the economy with Hon Billow Kerrow, and we've talked about some of the causes of the economic crisis, what we're doing wrong, trying to revive it, and now we want to take a look at what we should be doing instead. So Mheshimiwa, in your opinion, what strategies do you feel, if implemented, is going to sort us out, or rather rescue us from the crisis?
That's a very difficult situation, but to be in, and a very difficult question again. Just to give you an idea, today I was just reading the newspapers. If you read the newspapers today, you will see 21 million Kenyans have borrowed through Fuliza, and they borrowed a record 245 billion shillings. This is through the phone. And in fact, they say Safaricom processes 6 transactions every second, loans, or about 500,000 shillings per second. This is the situation that Kenyans are in. It shows clearly that people are finding it very difficult to make ends meet, and so life has become very difficult. The cost of living has really gone up. The government is not conscious of the fact that the cost of basic products have substantially gone up. 1, because of the COVID, and 2, because of the exchange rates, and 3, because of the taxes by the government, which is very significant. So in my view, one of the things that the government really needs to do now to try and help Kenyans is to lower some of the taxes or eliminate some of the taxes on the basic commodities. Look at the price of petrol. It's well over 100 shillings. It affects the cost of transportation. Where you used to pay 50 shillings on a matatu just a couple of years ago, today because of the taxes. And when I say taxes, it's not just the normal taxes, that come through the Act of Parliament. There are levies. This government has set up all manner of levies. If you are an importer, you know that you will have SGR levy, you have fuel levy, you have road levy, this levy, that levy, so many. So when you look at 1 liter of petrol, you'll be surprised, out of that 100, about 40 shillings goes to government, either as taxes or those charges, road levy or fuel levy or SGR, all those charges that the government makes. So one of the things that I think the government needs to do now, because of the current crisis of the COVID, because we are not out of the woods yet, the situation is in fact worse than it was before. Many businesses are still shut down and Kenyans are still jobless. What they need to do is reduce the taxes. That's something that they need to do, that can help people immediately, because to encourage businesses now to expand, to invest and create more jobs. And the people also have some money to spend, because the more people spend, the more it creates demand for goods and services, and so people will increase their production, people will increase their output, and so more people will be hired. I think economy is about all those actions, really, and so what government needs to do when the economy is bad is to try and create opportunities for expanding. Reducing taxes is one of the things. Two, I think government is also a major player in the economy in terms of the expenditures. But what we have seen is that most of the government expenditures in recent years has been on the mega projects. Money is going to China, money is going to big, contractors. I think to the extent where that many companies that have provided goods and services to government in the last many years have not been paid. Despite all the rhetoric that the government is going to pay, all its suppliers and contractors and, to clear the pending bills, what they call pending bills, they haven't. They are, in counties, nearly 100 billion in national government is much more than that even. I think that will also help government, because when you have a small business and you've provided goods and services to government and you have not been paid, it hurts you. It makes, actually, people have shut down their businesses because of that. So I think it's something that they need to do in order to encourage it. Thirdly, I think I've mentioned earlier that they need to create some stimulus, for these SMEs, for the informal sector, provide more inputs in the agricultural sector. This is where majority of Kenyans survive, and create opportunities for them by, subsidizing. It happens in other countries. The government, through arrangement with the banks, provides, subsidized loans to farmers, subsidized loans to specific sectors of the economy, and this is through arrangement with the banks, so that the government does chip in, so that the banks can give people. Today, what you borrow, if you are an SME, a small little hair salon, the rate at which you borrow from a bank is the same as the rate at which Safaricom will borrow. And it doesn't make sense. The same rates. The bank will not look at the fact that you are a small business or you're a small farmer. They'll still lend to you at the same. I think that's something that they can do. The government can really to deliberately, encourage banks to provide a certain percentage of all their, loans and advances to specific sectors of the economy, and that becomes conditional to their license. Mm-hmm. That I think they can do that. Fourthly, I think they need to expand some of the programs that they have, which are really token. The Kazi za Mitaani things. This is small jobs that they are providing. I think they need to the government needs to expand and provide more opportunities, so that as many jobless people as possible can be absorbed in this time when there is crisis, including the money that they send to the vulnerables, including the money that they send out to people who are not who they send through the vouchers. I think there's some money that they send is not much. They said sending to about 8 million, but the amounts can also be. So I think those are areas where the impact would be felt much more than some of the trillions that are being spent on big infrastructure projects or other development or other government operations. Fourthly, I think the government needs to cut down on unnecessary expenditures which are not a priority, and they can do this by rationalizing some of the government ministries, some of the government departments. We have a government that lives large. You go to a government office, they live better than even the private sector offices. I think the government can rationalize, because that would then mean they'll have to reduce the amount of, it will help them to reduce the taxes and some of the money and channel the rest of the money to the areas that need. For example, one area that I think also needs priorities is the counties. Because there are 47 counties. If the government does not pay money to the counties on time, then many activities and programs and suppliers of goods and services in those counties are also impacted adversely. So they ought to also live to the obligations in law and send money to the counties. So there are many, I think, things that the government can do, but I mentioned earlier, the elephant in the room is the huge public debt and the taxes, and these are the things that they can deal with immediately.
Thank you for that, Mheshimiwa. And just before we wrap up, you touched on the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects on the economy. So right now, seeing as we have received the COVID-19 vaccines, do you think it's now time to finally lift the restrictions that have really set back our businesses? Even now they're crying for the president to lift the curfew, for example. Or can we go a bit longer with the restrictions?
In my view, the only other major, the only restriction regarding COVID that is in place is the curfew that starts at 10 p.m. And in my view, which affects mostly the entertainment joints and so forth. In my view, that needs to be extended. I don't think we are out of the woods. The situation in the last few weeks has been very alarming. The number of the incidence rate is very high. The prevalence is rising very fast, and the situation is, in our neighboring countries is also getting worse. And many countries, even in Europe and so forth, are still facing challenges, even with the vaccinations that are going on, because vaccines are not an immediate antidote. That you get vaccines today and tomorrow the thing is gone. No, it will take time. Even in countries that have capacity to vaccinate all their people, it's still they still have these restrictions. So in my view, I think it would be too early, and it would be imprudent to lift the sanctions which are in place, which include the. I think we need to balance. But in my view, that is the last thing that we have, and I don't think we need to lift that, because then those entertainment facilities are the ones that create a lot of opportunities for for faster spread of the virus. So I think the government needs to wait out and see and what happens in the next few weeks, because the situation is alarming, really.
All right, very valid point there, Mheshimiwa. Thank you so much. That is former Mandera Senator, who is also the former chair of the Senate Finance Committee, Honorable Billow Kerrow. Thank you so much for making time for us today. I've learned a lot from you. And we've come to the end of the program. Thank you too for staying with us. My name is Sumaya Hussein. I will see you next week, same time, same place. Have a good night and a great weekend.
Horizon TV, the beacon for the nation.
قال تعالى في محكم تنزيله بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم.
Ninasaha kutoka pwani.
هذا الدين قال الله قال الرسول قال الصحابة هم أولو العرفان.